All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and for the last few months we've been concentrating on Bible decodes, New Testament decodes, and we've delved into a few different, avenues of thinking, but for a little while now we've been focused on the Roman origins hypothesis. That is that the New Testament was written in whole or in part by the Romans, the Caesars. And this does tend to shed light on a lot of issues. There are no shortage of authors out there who have tried to propagate this thesis, from Bruno Bauer back in the 19th century to Sir Ronald Syme and James Ballantyne Hannay at Oxford in the early 20th century, and then Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso in the late 20th century, Joseph Atwill starting in the 21st century, and also Henry Davis, and now Michael Menescotz. And we are looking at his book, Menasgotz, that is called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And the Flavians were the dynasty of Caesars who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 to 96 AD. And that includes Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And the thinking goes that sometime after the Jewish War, the Romans were fighting a 7-year-long war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. They wrote the New Testament, and they backdated it by 40 years and put Jesus's ministry in the early 30s AD. And at the same time, they wrote a history of the Jewish war. Now, both Emperor Vespasian and Emperor Titus were generals for the Roman military in that war. And after they were both wounded in the war, as a matter of fact. And after that war got over, they decided to do some wartime or slightly after wartime propaganda. A psychological operation to neutralize or neuter or domesticate or prune or mellow out the Jews. Because the Jews, this war against the Jews was just the culmination of 125 years of almost constant war or insurrection or revolution or uprising with the Jews that the Romans had to deal with. The Romans had dozens, hundreds of nations under their umbrella, and the Jews were just super high maintenance for them. They were unable to assimilate the Jews. And in particular, they were unable to assimilate or absorb the Jews' religion. Now, that was the basic approach that the Romans had to religion, was to absorb everybody's religion. In the Roman Empire, it was like almost every day of the year was a celebration of somebody's religion, the holy days of somebody's religion, because there were so many different groups that were trying to be absorbed by the Romans. But this didn't work with the Jews, because the Jews had a monotheistic God who was a control freak and who, thought that his people were the chosen people, and who had a long list of rituals and strictures that the Jews had to keep up with: circumcision, animal sacrifice, kosher food laws, strictures against graven images. These were all things that prevented them from merging with the Romans. And, the thing was that the Jews were willing to die to keep their religion intact. And so, it didn't do that much good to kill them. You kill a few of them and then there's some more that were ready to stand up. And so it was just super high maintenance for the Romans. And so they knew that the Jews had been waiting on a Messiah as well, because the Old Testament prophesied a Messiah to come at this time in the first century. And the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for was a military general who was going to help them throw the colonial power out of Judea. And there were a number of different Jews who were strong candidates for that role of Messiah at this time. In particular, before the war, there was Simon and John and Eleazar, and they were all leaders of this zealot faction that actually kicked out the Herods, who were the puppet rulers of Rome. They weren't Romans, but they were their puppet government of Judea. And the Jews took the the temple in Jerusalem and took control there for a brief period until Emperor Nero called in General Vespasian to lay siege to the temple at Jerusalem. And eventually Nero was assassinated, and a number of other Roman emperors were assassinated before Vespasian got the call in 69 AD. When he became the new emperor, he left the reins of the military over to his son Titus. And so both Vespasian and Titus had about a 3-year stint in Jerusalem fighting this war. Not just Jerusalem, but primarily. And so the Romans wrote this history of this long war against the Jews, and it was a companion piece to the New Testament that they wrote, or at least the Gospels. We'll just say the Gospels for now. And they gave the pen name of Josephus to the War of the Jews, or Jewish War as it is known, and it is one of the most famous books that's ever been written. 7 volumes, and really gives us pretty much all of our information from the first century. These are really the only 2 works that exist from the first century: the New Testament and Josephus's War of the Jews, especially until the 20th century when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. So that raises a red flag right there. And, because the Caesars were in charge of censorship. If a text actually got out there, it was because the Caesars were okay with it, or even encouraged it. And Titus actually signed his name to the work by Josephus as he approved, gave his thumbs up to it. But we know that Josephus, whoever Josephus was, according to his autobiography, he lived for the last 20 years or 30 years of his life at Rome, at Caesar's palace, in a townhouse that they got for him, and he went by the name of Flavius Josephus because he was adopted by the Flavian emperors as a member of their family. Even though he was a Jewish general that surrendered to Vespasian and then defected to the Romans, and then they turned around and adopted him into his family, and into their family, and made him the court historian for the Flavians. If you believe that, there's literally so many things in Josephus's War of the Jews that are nearly impossible to believe, that it rivals the Gospels for how unbelievable it is. But at least with the Gospels, you can always say God did it. But with the War of the Jews, you can't really say that. It's supposed to be a history. It's supposed to have really happened, and we do believe that it really happened, that, you know, Emperor Vespasian really existed and Emperor Titus really existed, and they really did fight this 7-year-long war against the Jews. So, but the basic pattern, there are many, many, many patterns, but Josephus and the New Testament are the Gospels are intended to be read together, intertextually. They were written by the same people for the same reason at the same time. And this can be demonstrated by the panoply of parallels between the two texts. Many different families or themes of patterns. But one of the main patterns was that, Jesus had a three-year ministry in Judea in the early 30s. Titus had a 3-year military campaign in Judea in the early 70s. Every place that Titus goes in his military campaign, Jesus also goes in the same order. And every adventure or happening that occurs in Titus's military campaign also occurs in Jesus's campaign or ministry. Not exactly the same, but conceptually the same. What they call typology. It's of the same type. It is, one event after another, after another, after another, after another, that are in the same order, evoking the same conceptual understanding, and occurring at the same location, and occurring exactly 40 years apart. Now, this is just one of many patterns. There are many, many other patterns that are reflected in Revelation, in the Pauline epistles, and in other parts of the Gospels. But this is kind of what Michael Menescot's focuses on. Not particularly this theme, but the book of Luke and War of the Jews by Josephus. And he digs in and tries to find parallels between the two. And after digging around, he found an overwhelming 250 parallels in the book of Luke. And not only that, but he decides to graph them out on a piece of chart. And he puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis. Verse 1 at the bottom, verse 24 chapter 1 at the bottom, chapter 24 at the top. And then he puts Josephus on the horizontal axis, paragraph 1 at the left-hand side, paragraph 694 on the right-hand side. And every time he finds a parallel, he puts a dot there. After doing so with all 250 dots, he, I'm sure, had noticed that he had formed 5 perfect or near perfect letters in Latin, APTVS, which I believe stands for Arius or Aries Piso Titus Vespasianus. The Titus Vespasianus is hardly open to even debate, given that Titus Vespasian, the TVS imprint, is actually used on Roman coins from the period. So what this means is that not only did the Romans write the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, or at least the Gospel of Luke, but they signed their name to it. And so, to me, that's pretty overwhelming evidence. How many coincidences does it take before you go beyond the standard of standard deviations? How many standard deviations do you have to get before, you know, the chance of coincidence is negligible? And so we're going to take over here with Menescot's discussing some of it. Like, the last thing he came up with is Arius Piso is supposed to have been the Pisos were a powerful Roman family, and they were related to the Flavians. And Arius Piso was independently fingered by both Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso as being the true author of the New Testament, and the author who wrote under the name Josephus. And he wrote under many other different pseudonyms as well. And that is traced back from a lot of the work of Sir Ronald Syme by focusing very closely on the letters that were written back and forth between a lot of these Roman royals. They were able to decipher who had what pseudonym, kind of based on who was where when. And so, you know, they both are fluent in all of these languages, and they had to really kind of work like a detective to figure out who is who in this kind of name shell game. And both of them independently determined that this guy named Arius Piso was the author, even though Arius Piso doesn't really even exist in the historical record. He only exists by implication of a number of different pseudonyms. Now, his family definitely exists. But anyway, he was looking here at Luke chapter 4, I believe, where Jesus says, get thee behind me. Now, behind me in Greek, which is the language that the New Testament is written in, and that's another red flag, because it wouldn't have been written in Greek if it were written by a bunch of Aramaic-speaking fishermen living in Judea. But it would have been written in Greek if it were written in Rome. Greek and Latin were the primary languages there. And most of the royals spoke and wrote in both. And so opiso is the word for behind, get thee behind me. And this pairs up with another verse from Josephus. So here where he says, get thee behind me, that word opiso, it means the piso, because O also means the piso. So in Luke, it says the piso, and in Josephus, there's that same construction, but it's a different word that also means the. I can't remember what the word is right now, but it's in paragraph 616, and it means the Arius. So Those are two corresponding paragraphs. One is the Piso and the other is the Arius. Now, after that, he says, it also gives us insight into what the Flavian emperor's final religion was supposed to involve. Jesus gaining power over hell or Hades on the third day is equated with the Jews setting fire to their holy temple on the third day. And Jesus speaking with the devil is being equated with Artorius, the Arius, hinting at the Arios or Ares or Mars, god of war, which also is a hill, summoning Lucifer in the flames and Lucius then being destroyed. This was all in Josephus. This is one of the strongest hints that the Flavians were to be presented as Roman supreme gods with power over heaven and Hades and the devil, that Jerusalem would be presented as literally Hades, and that by destroying it, leaving no stone upon another, they overcame it and thus gained power over Hades. For further detail about precisely which gods they wish to be worshipped as, see my 5th paper where I show that Titus may have wanted to be viewed as Hercules, implying Vespasian is Hercules' father, Zeus. Zeus is the supreme Roman god, and in Greek mythology, I think, isn't Zeus Jupiter in Roman? So Zeus is the supreme Roman god. He's the supreme Greek god. Or he says Zeus is the supreme Roman god in that in Greek mythology, Zeus's sons are the ones appointed as judges of the afterlife. So along with Ares or Mars, Zeus and Hercules would be an obvious choice. All the first century followers needed to know is that O and Tio are words meaning the in Greek, and that Arius or Ares, Piso, was a title of Titus, which they would have been told by their priest. Or more accurately, they would be told everything necessary to guide their belief, because that's how a cult works. If this idea that the New Testament is interested in the Roman concept of Hades seems surprising, it might be less so if we note that it directly refers to Hades, which is clearly Roman mythology, an astonishing 11 times. Some Bibles mistranslate these passages, inserting the word hell, while others retain the correct original word Hades. The most significant mention of Hades in the Gospels is found at Luke 16, verse 19, which discusses Hades in connection with Lazarus, who Jesus resurrects in John. Well, I wouldn't go that far. That is something that Joseph Atwill discusses, and Jesus does not resurrect Lazarus. Instead, it is a brutal joke that the Romans, now you have to remember that the Romans hated the Jews and that they mocked them with every opportunity that they got with writing this gospel. And they tried to neutralize them. The Jews were waiting for a Roman, they were waiting for a Messiah to overthrow the Romans. So the Romans gave them a Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack and turning the other cheek on oppression and asking Father to forgive the Romans for they know not what they do, and believing that the Roman slave owner was had the greatest faith in all of Israel. Meanwhile, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers outside the temple and disrupting the business of the Jewish entrepreneurs selling doves and pigeons outside the temple, thereby disrupting the Jews' sacred rituals. So the Romans dreamt up a Messiah who was totally pro-Roman and totally anti-Jew, if you can believe that. So that's another red flag that you have to, place on the both the New Testament and Josephus. Okay, so the most significant mention of Hades in the gospel. Okay, in Greek, Lazarus is Lazaros. The A-Z are the first and last letters in Latin. Lazarus is in Greek is Lazaros, which you just said, which contains the word Azaros, who the Gospels indicate as being Jesus. Jesus' great, 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 great grandfather. And Azaros is known to be short for Azarius. Arius in the Latinization of the Greek word Arios. So the emphasis is on war gods or the god Mars. This allows us to make connections as follows. Lazarus in Greek is Lazaros, which he said the third time in 5 lines, which evokes Jesus' ancestor Azaros, which is short for Azarius, which in Greek can be seen as Arius, meaning as of Aries, or A to Z of gods, or the first to the last of all gods. That's another red flag that comes from Revelation, where Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. Well, Jesus would have been speaking in Aramaic, and Omega or Alpha they're not the last, first and last letters of those languages. Alpha or Aleph is the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, but Omega is only the last letter in the Greek alphabet, and so he would have said, I am the Aleph and the Zadi, or I believe that's the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Why did Jesus resurrect a man called Lazarus, rejecting hundreds of millions of other candidates? And why was this seen as such an important story in the early centuries of Christianity? The reason is simply that it is a riddle, with the solution implying that Jesus has power not only over death, but also over all the gods. This has implications for Jesus' second coming, who is Titus, because Titus fulfills the prophecies of Jesus. Jesus makes prophecies in the New Testament, and many dozens of them, or at least a dozen of them, are fulfilled by Titus. So people who believe that and people have known this throughout history. The books of Josephus used to be part of the Latin Bible. Okay, and they knew that Titus was the second coming of Jesus, but we've drifted away from that, and now we're saying that there hasn't been a second coming of Jesus yet, and we're waiting for it still now, 2,000 years later, and it happened 1950 years ago. According to the history of Josephus, Titus fulfilled all of the prophecies. Not all of them. There are a few other people that Vespasian fulfilled a few of them as well. It is either a way of saying that Titus has power over all the gods, or rather embodies all the other gods who are mere facets of his godly self, or perhaps that Titus is the resurrection of all gods combined. If the message were at the heart of a secret cult, with control over promotion within the Roman legions, this would explain why the Roman catacombs and sarcophagi dating from the earliest centuries of Christianity have over 100 paintings illustrating Lazarus' resurrection. I didn't know that. But if you go over and you look at Atwill's version, his argument, and you go over all this Lazarus stuff, Jesus does not resurrect Lazarus. Jesus digs Lazarus' dead body up and exhumes it. They bring Lazarus to his house, which is where Mary and Martha also live, in Bethany. And they have to smother his body with perfume. You can look at the coding from paragraph 618 of Jewish War by Josephus, where during the siege of Jerusalem, a woman named Mary has an infant son, and they're experiencing a severe famine. And so she decides to kill her son and roast it and eat it. And she says, and she eats half of it. And then some Jews raid her place where she's living, and she offers the other half to them. And she says, I have saved you the good portion. And they are disgusted and they storm off or whatever. But the exact same phrase is used by Jesus when Martha reprimands him for not telling Mary to help Martha with the chores in the kitchen. And Jesus says, Mary has saved the good portion. And so what is happening is that the anointing party that's going on there is a butchering of Lazarus's dead body so that they can, and that's what they say, about Lazarus, they made him a supper. So they are butchering Lazarus, and then they're getting ready to eat him. And that is exactly the same thing that happens in Josephus. So this is what I'm just saying. The Romans are ruthless, ridiculing, mocking, with the most black humor, and a lot of pornography is all embedded into the New Testament in code. And if you, as a Christian,